She just needed coins for milk until his daughter whispered, "I like her better than all the fancy ladies." Kansas Territory, December 1882. Snow fell in hard, slanted lines across the open plain, carried by winds that screamed like ghosts across the frozen prairie. The sun had nearly vanished, bleeding red and gold behind a wall of gray. In the distance stood Granger Ranch, sturdy, silent, and wrapped in frost. Delaney Rose trudged toward the front gate, her boots soaked through, her fingers red and cracked from the cold. She clutched a woven basket against her chest, and inside, wrapped in 3 layers of ragged cloth, a baby stirred with a thin, hungry cry. She raised her hand and knocked. Moments passed. Then the heavy door creaked open, revealing a tall man in a wool coat and snow-dusted boots. A rifle was slung across. His back, and his eyes, cool and measured, studied her with suspicion. "I'm not asking for charity," Delaney said, shivering but steady. "I need work." The man didn't move. "You just gave birth. You cannot do a man's job." Delaney tightened her grip on the basket. "Just a few coins, enough to buy milk." "I'm not begging, sir." He stepped forward slightly, brow furrowing as he finally looked at the child in her arms. The infant's lips were a faint purple, his breathing shallow. A flicker of something crossed the man's face, concern or maybe memory, but it was gone before she could read it. "You are on Grangerland," he said, "and I am Thomas Granger." She gave a slight nod. Delaney rose. He glanced at the snow behind, her at the fading light, then back to her face. "Why come here? I heard you run a large operation. I thought maybe there might be something I could do. Cleaning, mending, kitchen work." Her voice cracked. "Please." Before he could answer, a small voice called from the doorway. "Papa." A little girl, no older than 3, stood barefoot on the wooden floorboards just beyond the threshold. Her cheeks were flushed from the indoor fire, her curls tangled like copper ribbons. "Go back inside, Clara," Thomas said gently but firmly. But Clara ignored him. She stepped out onto the porch, tugging a small wool blanket with her, and walked up to Delaney with fearless curiosity. The girl didn't speak right away. She just stared up at Delaney, then reached out and touched the edge of the frayed shawl wrapped around her shoulders. After a moment, Clara looked up at her father and whispered, "She smells like Mama." "Not perfume." The words hit the cold air like a spark on dry tinder. Thomas stiffened. Delaney said nothing, her eyes wide with surprise. Clara stepped closer to the basket and peered inside. The baby stirred. Clara smiled. "Baby," she said. Thomas rubbed his forehead, exhaled slowly. He looked again at the child's face, pale and trembling in the cold, then at the woman, clearly near collapse, standing in the snow without gloves. "Come inside," he muttered. Delaney blinked. "Sir, 1 week, that is all. Light work. If I find you lying about anything, you leave. You understand? I do not need another mouth to feed, Miss Rose. You understand that? I brought my own bread," she said, holding up a small wrapped bundle from the side pocket of her coat. It was barely a crust. Thomas said nothing more. He stepped aside and held the door open. Delaney hesitated, then stepped forward, the snow crunching beneath her worn soles. Clara followed her, small hand reaching to brush against the basket once more. Inside, warmth struck like a wave. Firewood crackled in the hearth. The scent of stew hung in the air. Delaney's knees buckled slightly, but she caught herself. She stood, chin raised, as Thomas led her toward the side of the kitchen, where a wooden bench and wool blanket waited. "You can sleep there. You'll find water and cloth near the stove." "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, then turned to Clara. "Upstairs. Bed now." Clara didn't argue, but as she passed Delaney, she reached up and gently brushed a lock of damp hair from her cheek. Then she smiled. "She can stay, Papa." Thomas paused at the foot of the stairs, jaw tight. He looked back at Delaney, at her cracked hands, the infant breathing weakly, the snow melting in puddles at her feet. "She stays 1 week," he said again, more to himself than to her. Delaney sat on the bench cradling her son, her eyes closed in exhaustion. For the first time in days, she felt warmth on her skin. The baby sighed in his sleep, and outside, the snow kept falling. Delaney. Rose woke before the sun. Her breath fogged the frosted window above the kitchen bench where she'd slept, the baby still bundled beside her. Carefully, she slipped from beneath the warm blanket, wrapped Samuel against her chest, and stepped into the cold morning. By the time Thomas came downstairs, the smell of fresh cornbread was already in the air. He paused in the doorway, surprised to find her at the stove, stirring a pot one-handed while bouncing the baby gently against her shoulder. "You do not need to cook," he said. "I'm not doing it for free," she replied softly. The next few days passed in quiet rhythm. Delaney swept the floors, scrubbed laundry with raw knuckles, and chopped vegetables with the precision of someone who had once cooked for 10. She spoke little, her eyes always tracking Clara or the baby, or the snow falling endlessly outside the window. Thomas kept his distance. On the 3rd day he found her in the barn. She was milking one of the goats, clumsily, but determined. The baby was tied against her chest with a piece of linen, sleeping soundly. "You ever done that before?" he asked. "No," she said, "but I watched my neighbor's girl once. She said goats were like husbands. Kick less if you're quiet." Thomas chuckled, then caught himself. He cleared his throat and walked off. Clara, meanwhile, had become Delaney's shadow. The little girl followed her everywhere, tugging at her skirts, sitting by her feet, sometimes simply watching her rock the baby in silence. She no longer fussed when her father left the room, nor clung to the hem of his coat. One morning she even refused to let her old nursemaid pick her up. "I want Miss Laney," Clara said stubbornly. The nurse, insulted, turned to Thomas. "She has grown far too attached. She's 3, he replied, but his gaze lingered on Delaney's gentle arms wrapping around the girl. The baby nestled between them. That evening, as Delaney folded fresh-washed linens by the fire, Clara rested her head in her lap and whispered, "Can we keep her?" Delaney didn't hear it, but Thomas did. He returned to his study without a word. Later that night, Thomas went to fetch wood and passed the small laundry room near the kitchen. The door was half open. He paused when he saw the basket Delaney always carried, the one she never let anyone touch. He didn't mean to look, but the cold wind caught the flap of cloth covering it, and curiosity got the better of him. Inside the basket was not food, not bottles, not anything but a folded child's shirt, wrapped around a piece of hard, stale bread and a tin cup with a few drops of water. No milk, no coin. Thomas stared at it for a long moment. The next day, Clara came down with a fever. Her cheeks burned and her body shook, racked with sobs. The nursemaid tried everything. Blankets, broth, lullabies. Nothing worked. Delaney, hearing the cries, stepped into the room without asking. The nurse looked ready to object, but Thomas raised a hand. Let her try. Delaney sat beside Clara, hummed a soft tune, and pressed a cool cloth to the child's brow. Within minutes, the crying ceased. Thomas stood in the doorway, arms folded, his mouth tight, but his eyes softened as he watched Clara fall asleep against Delaney's chest, a small hand resting on the baby's blanket. He didn't say a word. But that night, when he brought in more firewood, he placed an extra quilt by Delaney's bench. He didn't say who it was from, and Delaney didn't ask. The morning came with a flurry of snow and the clatter of carriage wheels. 3 ladies from town had arrived at the Granger Ranch, wrapped in velvet cloaks and wide smiles, their boots untouched by mud, their intentions wrapped tight behind batting eyelashes. Thomas greeted them with his usual reserve, nodding politely as they stepped into the parlor. Delaney stood in the kitchen, stirring stew over the stove. The baby, cradled in a sling against her chest. Her dress was plain, her apron stained and her fingers cracked from the cold. She had not been told about visitors. Clara, her cheeks red from playing in the snow, peeked in from the hallway and frowned at the sight of the women. One wore a bright yellow dress with bows down the sleeves. Another smelled heavily of rose water. The third clutched a handkerchief embroidered with her initials and glanced often at the mirror. "Who are they?" Clara asked Thomas, tugging at his pant leg. "They are friends from town," he said evenly. "They came to visit." Clara looked unconvinced. She slipped away and scurried to the kitchen, climbing onto the stool beside Delaney. "Are they going to stay here?" she asked. Delaney glanced at the stew. "Not for long, I think." Clara nodded, leaned against her side, and whispered, "I like you better than all the fancy ladies." Thomas, passing by the doorway, paused at those words. He did not say anything, but he lingered a moment longer before walking on. The women fluttered around the parlor like butterflies with painted wings. They asked questions about the ranch, about Thomas's schedule, about Clara's schooling. One offered to teach music. Another suggested new curtains. Delaney remained quiet, focused on her tasks. She wiped the table, folded laundry, mashed boiled carrots for Samuel, all while the child slept against her chest, and Clara followed at her heels like a shadow. Thomas noticed. He watched the way Delaney held the baby close, how she whispered lullabies, soft enough not to disturb the silence, how her hands, though rough, were gentle. She never looked his way, never tried to charm him, never offered anything but the truth of her presence. At lunch, the ladies sat at the table, dainty and straight-backed, complimenting the stew with forced smiles. One, the one with the yellow dress, looked at Delaney with narrowed eyes. "You must be the house girl," she said sweetly. "I suppose every ranch needs one of those." Delaney simply nodded, her gaze steady. "Such a shame," the woman continued, sipping her tea, "to have to work so hard just for milk. But I suppose when one chooses a certain path in life, one must accept its consequences." Clara dropped her spoon. Her eyes flashed. "She's not a beggar," the child snapped. "She makes better stew than you ever will." The room fell silent. Delaney froze. Thomas set down his fork. The lady in yellow smiled tightly. "I beg your pardon, you heard me?" Clara said, standing up on her chair. "She's not asking for anything. She works and she smells like home." Delaney gently pulled Clara down, smoothing her dress. "It's all right, Clara," she said quietly, but Thomas rose slowly from his seat. "That is enough," he said, voice low but firm. "Miss Delaney is not here to entertain insults. She's here because she works harder than anyone I know, and because my daughter sleeps through the night again, for the first time in months." The ladies blinked. The one with the rosewater perfume cleared her throat. "Of course, we meant no offense." "Think this lunch is over," Thomas said, his eyes not leaving Delaney's face. "Thank you for coming." The women stood flustered. Coats were fetched, carriages summoned. Within 15 minutes, the parlor was empty again. Delaney washed dishes in silence, cheeks burning. Thomas lingered in the doorway. "She should not have said that," he muttered. Delaney shrugged. "People say worse. You should not have to hear it at all." She turned then, facing him for the first time all day. "I'm not here for pity, Mr. Granger. I just want to earn enough to take care of my son." He nodded. "I know." Their eyes met, something unsaid stretching between them. Then a cry broke the moment. Samuel stirred in, the sling, fussing. Delaney instinctively rocked him, humming that same soft melody. Clara peeked from the hallway and smiled. Thomas walked away quietly, but his chest was tight, not from discomfort, from the strange, unfamiliar pull of something beginning to grow. The storm rolled in without warning. By nightfall, rain tapped furiously on the windows. Wind howled through the trees, and the barn creaked, like a ghost's whisper. Inside the modest guest room Delaney shared with her baby, the fire was low, and the chill in the air had returned with sharp teeth. Samuel had been fussy since sundown. His soft coos turned into dry coughs, then rattled wheezes. Delaney paced with him in her arms, wrapping him tighter, whispering soothing words into his hair. But the sound of his breathing shifted, shallower, ragged. When she lit the lantern and pulled back the blanket, her heart dropped. His lips had turned a faint blue. "No, no, no, no," she gasped, pressing him to her chest, rocking. "Harder, please breathe, baby, breathe." Samuel let out a choking cough, then stilled. Delaney screamed. The door to the main house slammed open. Thomas, barefoot and breathless, appeared in the hallway within seconds, the lantern in his hand trembling. "What happened?" he demanded. Delaney was sobbing, unable to form words. She thrust the tiny bundle toward him, her eyes wild. "He's not breathing. He's cold. He's—" She collapsed to her knees. Thomas took the baby, fingers fumbling as he felt for movement, warmth, breath, anything. Samuel's skin was icy. His chest rose barely, almost imperceptibly. "Delaney, get every dry towel you have now." She flew across the room, snatching cloths, a thin quilt, anything. Thomas stripped his own shirt and wrapped Samuel against his bare chest. "Skin to skin," he muttered. "That's what Doc used to say." He cradled the baby, rubbing his tiny back in firm, quick circles. The fire was almost out. He grabbed the poker and stoked it. With one hand, while holding the baby with the other, Delaney returned, shaking, arms full. Thomas turned to her. "Whiskey? Do you have any?" She nodded, ran to her trunk, pulled out a small flask wrapped in cloth. He poured a bit into his palm and began rubbing it down Samuel's back and chest, warming his tiny limbs. "He's not crying," Delaney choked out. They worked in silence, both kneeling, both trembling. He passed the child back to her once he had warmed the baby's front. She tucked Samuel inside her dress, pressed him against her heart. "Come on, little man," she whispered, tears falling onto his head. "You're stronger than this. You've made it this far." And then just a flicker, a gurgle, a tiny cough, the smallest breath. Thomas leaned in, eyes wide. There, right there again. "Delaney," gasped as Samuel's lips began to flush with color. He coughed once more, wheezed in air, and then softly, weakly, cried. Delaney broke down completely, curling around him, her sobs uncontrollable now. Thomas sat back on his heels, wiping his brow with his sleeve. The rain kept pounding outside, but the silence inside was deafening. "Thank you," she whispered, voice raw. "Thank you for saving my son." He looked at her. Really looked. Her hair was falling loose, face streaked with tears, dress damp with milk and sweat. Yet in that moment, she was the strongest woman he had ever seen. "You did most of it," he said softly. She shook her head. "I froze. I couldn't think." He touched her arm, not to comfort, but to anchor. "You didn't freeze. You screamed for help. That saved him." Delaney nodded slowly, brushing the baby's damp forehead. Thomas rose, stoked the fire higher, added more wood. The warmth began to return to the room. Clara peeked in from the hallway, eyes wide. "Is he okay?" Delaney smiled weakly. "Yes, sweetheart." "He's okay now." Thomas walked over, scooped up his daughter, and whispered something in her ear. She hugged his neck, then toddled to Delaney, laying her small hand on the baby's head. "I told Mama Laney he was a strong baby," Clara said matter-of-factly. Delaney blinked, startled. She glanced at Thomas, who merely gave a small shrug. "She's been calling you that for a while," he murmured. "Only when you're not around." Delaney's lips trembled. The storm outside began to pass, the thunder softening, the wind calming. Thomas fetched a thicker blanket, covered them both gently. "I'll stay outside the door for a bit, just in case." Delaney looked up. Her eyes met his, and this time there was no guardedness, only gratitude and something else, something unnamed but growing. He nodded once, then stepped out, leaving the door slightly ajar. As the fire crackled and the baby slept once more, Delaney leaned back, her heart still pounding. But for the first time in months, she did not feel alone. It was a cold Sunday morning when the past came knocking. Thomas was feeding the horses when he heard the knock on the main house door. Sharp, impatient. Clara was still asleep upstairs. Delaney opened the door with Samuel on her hip, his face tucked into her shawl. Standing on the porch was a man in a long wool coat, snow crusted on his boots, a Bible tucked under one arm. He removed his hat. His face was stern, angular, and familiar. "Delaney," he said. "You look thinner." Her breath caught. "Father." Thomas stepped onto the porch behind her, wiping his hands with a rag. He glanced at the man, then back at Delaney. The Reverend Jonathan Rose did not offer his hand. "I came for my daughter," he said simply, "and her bastard child." Delaney flinched. Thomas straightened. "You came from the East for this." "I came," the Reverend replied, "to undo a disgrace. She abandoned her family, her calling, her name, and now I find her working on a ranch, cradling a child born out of sin." Delaney stepped in front of Samuel protectively. "He is my son, and not your husband's," her father spat. "Because you have none." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "What is it you want, Reverend?" "To take them back. She will live under my roof. Obey my household, and the child will be raised by God. Or, he will be placed in a Christian orphanage where he will be saved from this lawless upbringing." Delaney's lips parted, but no sound came. Later that evening, Thomas found her packing in silence. "Delaney," he said quietly. "I have to go," she whispered. "If he takes me to court, he will win. He has standing. I have nothing. You have your son. Not if they take him." Thomas walked over slowly. "You're not leaving." She shook her head, tears burning her eyes. "You do not understand. He is powerful back home, and he is right. He will use every word in that book to shame me, to erase me." Thomas stood still for a long moment. Then he turned and left. When he returned, he had snow on his coat and fury in his jaw. The Reverend was sipping tea in the parlor when Thomas stormed in. "You say she brought shame," Thomas said. The Reverend looked up. "She has sinned." "No, she survived." Thomas's voice was steady. "You abandoned her the moment she needed you most. And now you come with scriptures, thinking they'll cover what you did. She dishonored her name. She lived with nothing but her son. And her will." He stepped closer. "A man who shames his daughter for surviving isn't fit to raise her child." The Reverend stood. "You would take in a fallen woman and raise her bastard under your roof." "I would," Thomas said. "And I will." Delaney stood in the hallway, clutching Samuel to her chest. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks, but her back was straight. Snow had begun to fall again, soft and quiet, like the world was holding its breath. The ranch house glowed faintly under a blanket of moonlight, firelight flickering through the windows. Inside, the silence was broken by a sharp cry, a thud, then a scream. Delaney dropped the ladle in the pot and ran to the porch. Clara was curled. On the wooden steps, one leg bent awkwardly under her. Tears streaked her cheeks. "I did not see the ice," Clara whimpered. Thomas came running from the stable, his boots crunching in the frost. "What happened?" he barked. She slipped, her ankles twisted. "Maybe sprained," Delaney said. already kneeling beside the girl. Her hands were steady, but her voice trembled. Clara clung to Delaney's neck as she was lifted into her arms. Thomas opened the door, heart pounding faster than he cared to admit. He'd seen broken bones before, even worse. But never in someone this small. Never in someone who looked at him like the sun rose in his beard. Delaney laid Clara gently on the settee by the fire and wrapped the girl in a quilt. She examined the ankle, wincing at the swelling. She needs rest. Maybe some herbs for the pain, she said softly, and to be held. Delaney gathered Clara close to her chest, humming a lullaby low under her breath. Her fingers stroked the child's hair. Clara's sobs softened, then stopped. Her tiny hand rested on Delaney's heart. Thomas watched from the doorway. The firelight lit the side of Delaney's face, and something old in him, something long buried, stirred. She looked so tired, so young, so steady. He turned away. That night, Thomas could not sleep. He sat by the window in his study, watching snow pile against the sill. In his hand, a folded pair of old wool gloves. They had once belonged to his wife. They were the last thing she knit before she died, and he had never given them to anyone, until now. He lit the lamp, took out a scrap of parchment, and began to write. "You gave my daughter back her laughter. You gave me back my peace. If you choose to stay, I'll build you more than a room. I'll build you a home." He folded the note without signing it. Quietly, he crept down the hall and set the gloves and letter on the small stool by Delaney's bed. She was curled there with Samuel in one arm and Clara in the other, 3 hearts beating in rhythm under one quilt. Thomas lingered in the doorway, then turned and walked away. Morning broke with the soft chirp of robins and the distant whistle of wind through the trees. Delaney stirred, Samuel fussing gently beside her. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and saw the gloves. She blinked, then noticed the note. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. She read once, then again. By the 3rd time, her eyes were glassy. Delaney pressed the note to her chest. She did not speak, did not ask, did not run to Thomas or pretend not to know. She just sat there breathing in a silence that was warmer than words. Later that morning, when she passed Thomas in the hallway, she said nothing. But he noticed her gloves were new, and her eyes were different, like something inside her had dared to hope again. The old guest room was the first to go. Thomas took it down with his own hands, plank by plank, window by window. He did not wait for help. He did not ask for approval. Tucker. Walls that once echoed with emptiness came apart under the weight of his quiet resolve. He worked quietly without announcement, without plans drawn up. Only the steady thud of hammer and creak of old nails marked the start of something new. Behind the house, near the patch of wildflowers Clara liked to pick in the warmer months, he began building. The land there was soft and sunlit in the mornings, shielded from wind by a gentle rise in the earth. It felt right. He laid the foundation carefully, every stone placed like it mattered. Then the floor joists, the posts, the beams, a modest cabin, nothing grand, just 2 rooms and a porch. But every beam was sanded smooth, every nail driven with purpose, like he was stitching something broken back together with his bare hands. Delaney noticed the noise first, then the smell of fresh-cut wood, then the way Thomas no longer disappeared into silence at dusk. Instead, he stayed near, measuring, sawing, constructing with a kind of focus that was almost reverent. "For a tool shed," she asked one morning, arms folded. Baby Samuel bundled against her chest. He met her gaze without flinching. Not unless hammers cry at night and need lullabies. She smiled, small and stunned. the kind of smile that came from somewhere deeper than politeness. From that day on, she worked beside him, holding up frames, fetching nails, brushing sawdust from her dress as she helped set windows into place. Samuel slept nearby in a crate lined with flannel. Clara, playing beside him with dandelions, wooden spoons, and grand stories only she could hear. There was something strangely joyful in it. Sawdust in their hair, sweat on their brows, the sun setting behind them like a benediction. Their hands ached, their backs sore, but their hearts quieter, as though the rhythm of building something real with another person had begun smoothing the sharp edges of their loneliness. They did not speak of what they were building, but they both knew. Delaney sang softly as she worked, sometimes lullabies for Samuel, sometimes hymns her father once taught her, now softened with gentler meaning and less fear. Her voice, once small and tight with caution, now floated into the beams of the unfinished roof and stayed there. Thomas listened, watched, and learned the shape of peace not from sermons, but from the curve of her shoulders in the late light, the way her hands brushed splinters from his skin, the sound of her laughter when Clara brought them lemonade in a mason jar with 2 straws and said, "You're both stinky." Sometimes they ate dinner on the steps of the half-built porch, cheese, bread, apples, and silence. The kind of silence that did not beg to be filled. One evening, as they laid the final plank of the porch, Thomas straightened, wiping his brow with a dusty sleeve. Delaney leaned against the beam, fingers resting on a flower Clara had tucked behind her ear. Thomas stared at her, then said, quiet but clear, "I do not care if the world calls you a sinner." Delaney froze. "My daughter calls you family, and I trust her more than I have ever trusted anyone." The silence that followed was not cold. It was heavy, full, honest. Delaney's eyes filled, but she did not look away. And for the first time, Thomas did not look away either. He'd just reached down, took her hand, and held it. Not as a man offering rescue, but as a man choosing a future. Spring came quietly to the ranch. The snow melted from the hills first, then from the valleys, and finally, from the roof of the small house behind the flower garden. Grass grew again. Buds curled open on the trees lining the pasture. Birds returned, timid at first, then bold, singing from the fence posts and swooping low over the pond. The earth softened, and the air smelled of damp soil and wild hope. Clara was the first to run barefoot through the meadow. Her laughter rose with the wind, ribbons. In her hair fluttering like flags of a new kingdom, she chased butterflies with all the solemnity of a princess guarding her realm. "Mama Laney," she called, voice full of sunshine. Delaney turned from the clothesline, a basket of linens at her hip. Her sleeves were rolled, her dress faded, and her hands bore the faint scars of winter work. But her face lit up at the sound of that little voice. She scooped Clara up with one arm and Samuel with the other, settling both children against her shoulders. Her smile caught the light, not polished, not practiced, just real. Thomas stood on the porch of the main house, blueprints rolled in his hand. They were for another addition, this time a proper parlor with wide windows and a fireplace. Somewhere warm for winter stories, for stormy nights, for long silences and quiet laughter. But he was not looking at the drawings. He was looking at them. The woman who had come in the snow with nothing but a baby and a voice too tired to tremble. The boy who had nearly slipped away but now giggled. In his mother's arms. And Clara. His Clara, so full of life again it almost hurt to remember. She had once been quiet. It hit him then. Not like lightning, but like the slow, steady thaw of ice. This was what it meant to come back to life. Not with grand gestures or declarations, but with tiny moments. A child's laugh, A second cup of tea left waiting, a woman humming while folding clean sheets. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, and Delaney hummed softly while knitting by the fire. Thomas sat at the kitchen table with pen and paper. The lantern flickered above him. The wood crackled in the hearth. He wrote slowly, "Mama, you told me once to find someone who brings peace, not excitement. You said love should feel like coming home, not like chasing fire. I think Clara found her for me before I even knew to look. She does not ask for much. She does not shine the way others do. But she glows, steady, quiet. She laughs like she earned it and holds my daughter like she was born to. I am ready to stop waiting for perfection. I am ready to choose what's real." He folded the letter and tucked it beside the small photo frame on the mantel. His mother's picture kept all these years. The wind whispered at the windows, but inside the house was still. Outside, Clara's voice rang out again in the distance, "Mama Laney." And in the dark, Thomas Granger smiled because now he knew she could stay forever. And maybe, just maybe, so could he. Some stories ride in with thunder. Others they arrive in the snow, quiet, trembling, but unshakable. She just needed coins for milk. He just needed peace for his child. But what they found was a home neither dared dream of. If this story warmed your heart, if it reminded you that love is sometimes built with hands chapped from work and hearts stitched back together, subscribe to Legends of the Wild West Stories. Here we tell tales of resilience, redemption, and the kind of love that lingers long after the snow melts. Hit subscribe. Stay for the stories, because in the Wild West, sometimes forever begins with a whisper.